Well, let's talk to Ash Regan, MSP for Edinburgh Eastern for the Alipur Party. She wants to talk about a story that we haven't really done much on down here lately, but it's a very interesting story, and it's really focusing an awful lot of people's minds up north. Sandy Peggy is a nurse at NHS Fife who's been the subject of all sorts of employment tribunal activity because she basically said she was subjected to unlawful harassment under the Equality Act 2010 because she was made to share a changing room with Dr. Beth Upton, who is a transgender woman. We had, of course, John Swinney just last week, I think it was, who's now the First Minister of Scotland for the SNP, saying that he believed that trans women were indeed allowed to enter a female toilet based on the fact that they thought they were women, even if they didn't do anything other than that. So let's talk to Ash about it, because coming up this weekend it's International Women's Day as well, and she's one who wants to talk about that. Ash, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Good to see you. This story, Sandy Peggy, has made a few headlines down south, but it's really been a very dominant story up there. Tell us a bit about it.
Yes, so it was the case was in the courts a couple of weeks ago, and it really has captured the attention both in Scotland but arguably around the world. This idea that women cannot, have a safe space to change. If you think about how many women in Scotland work in the NHS, obviously that's a job where you need to get changed at the beginning and the end, or maybe during your shift even. Yeah. And people expect to be able to change in single-sex changing rooms. And actually that is the law. So we are in a bit of a battleground in Scotland right now. And last week, I was involved as part of the committee that I'm on at the Scottish Parliament in questioning the Scottish Human Rights Commission. And the clue should really be in the title, I think, Mike, that they should be involved in watching and protecting and making interventions in order to uphold women's human rights in Scotland. That's part of their remit. That's the reason that they were set up. And yet they're not. So we're in a position right now in Scotland where there's an all-out assault on Scotland women's human rights, and yet you're asking the bodies that should be protecting it, and that would also include obviously the Scottish Government among other things, and the local authorities, and they're just sort of shrugging their shoulders as if there's nothing they can do, or it's not their responsibility, which is completely wrong. And
obviously we saw what this whole controversy did for Nicola Sturgeon. It pretty much finished her career. It made her have to leave the job as First Minister because of the controversy over that prisoner who was a trans woman who was put into a women's prison, and it turned out that she then reversed that idea and put him into a men's prison. The point about all of this really is that the SNP still seem captured by, the sort of trans lobby, don't they?
They do. Now, I would argue that this ideology and the failure to manage it correctly in Scotland has cost two First Ministers their job, Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf. Because if you remember back to the sort of downfall of Humza Yousaf, it was really over the Green Party's response to the caste review, which, as you'll remember, is also about this ideology and its the way that it's taken over in the health service and the way that children are treated and so on. So if John Swinney doesn't respond to this appropriately, and I believe that the public feeling on this is very clear, there's lots of opinion polling now that say, similar to the comment that you were reading out just before I came on, that people have had enough of this woke world. They don't want it. They want to go back to a time when, girls were able to go into a changing room and get changed, and they didn't have to be doing that in front of men.
Yeah.
They want to have sports where women are competing against other women. And, we have laws, for instance, on toilets in schools. Yeah. And yet there are schools all around Scotland where there are no male and female toilets. Right. So girls are just not going to the toilet. They're having to go to supermarkets at the lunchtime, in their lunch break, in order to use the loo. So I think the government do need to get a grip on this. They are failing to uphold the human rights of women in Scotland. Women are absolutely sick of this now, and the government really need to step up and show some leadership.
And going back to the Sandy Peggy case, the nurse at NHS Fife, that's apparently been, the employment tribunal's been adjourned until July. So as long as that case is still kind of active, if you like, and still going, I guess there will be people on both sides of this argument who won't resolve it until then.
Well, it certainly seems to be giving cover, I think, to some politicians who say that they can't talk about it because they're implying the case is live and they can't talk about it. I would argue that's completely false.
Of course it is,
Yes,
yeah.
we shouldn't be talking about this specific case, but it's not just about the specific case. This is really about the wider implications that this failure to uphold women's rights is having across, other areas of Scotland. So you mentioned prisons.
Yeah.
We have biological men in the women's prison estate in Scotland. We shouldn't. There are international obligations that state that that should not be happening.
Yeah.
Women's psychological and also their physical safety needs to be taken into account.
Right. And there's no question there's a disproportionate number of men who, shall we say, are posing as women in prisons who are doing it for the very purpose of getting access to that prison.
Yes, some of the data that I've seen show that it's a very high proportion of sex offenders that are claiming a trans identity. So we can't let this go past us. We need to engage our brains, use a bit of common sense, and think about the international obligations that we need to be upholding to make sure that women are protected.
Yeah.
So the government needs to get a grip on this. It's really getting to the stage where it's becoming ludicrous. And, the people that have stood up to this, so there's women and men that have stood up to this ideology, both in Scotland and in the UK and further afield, who I would argue are women's human rights defenders. The harassment and the intimidation that has been meted out to some of these people in various workplaces across Scotland is quite unprecedented in modern Scotland. So I would say that we really need to be moving away from this now, and we need to be taking seriously people's human rights.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Ash Regan, thank you very much indeed. MSP for Edinburgh Eastern from the Alapa Party. She said she wanted to highlight this particularly because of the fact that it's actually International Women's Day on Saturday. And isn't it rather ironic that there'll be some people celebrating that because they say they're women, even though they're actually not.